He hadn't picked up the phone in months. Then out of nowhere, my son called and asked me to join him for dinner. Not just any dinner, but a table at the fanciest restaurant in town. He even said he'd drive me himself. Miles was never one for surprises, and warmth was hardly his style. So when he greeted me with a smile and held the door open that evening, I should have known something was behind it. But I didn't. I let my guard slip. That was my first mistake. The wind had already turned sharp that week. November always carried a bite in our small Nebraska town. I'd just stacked the last of the firewood on the porch when the phone rang. I almost let it go. Most calls these days were the pharmacy or ladies from church. But this time it was Miles. His voice was softer than usual, almost casual. He said he and Trina thought it would be nice if the three of us went out together. I froze for a moment. Miles never suggested anything like that. He was always busy, always elsewhere. And Trina, she was never cruel, but she carried a kind of distance that no holiday table could erase. Still, something in me wanted to say yes. Maybe it was the loneliness settling on me lately like dust on the quilt at the foot of my bed. Or maybe it was that flicker of hope you never really lose as a mother, the hope that maybe your child finally sees you not as a burden, but as family. They came by just before sundown, Miles in a neat wool coat, Trina wrapped in one of those camel jackets she wore like armor. The restaurant glowed with amber light, polished wood, crisp linens, and silver that gleamed under the chandeliers. I hadn't stepped foot in a place like that in years. Miles held the door for me. Trina took my coat with a smile that seemed a touch warmer than usual. She even complimented my scarf. For a brief second, I let myself believe it, that maybe something had changed. Maybe they were finally seeing me again. We sat at a small corner table. The waiter brought out a bottle of red. Miles poured my glass himself. I told him water was fine, but he waved it off. He said we were celebrating. I smiled, but inside something stirred. A quiet part of me that had been asleep for years suddenly woke up. I told myself it was just nerves. But deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. The wine was smooth, older than I expected, with a soft finish that lingered too long. Miles knew I wasn't much of a drinker, yet he filled my glass to the top. I thanked him and took a sip. He smiled back, but it never reached his eyes. Trina sat across from me with that same careful look she always used, polite on the surface, distant underneath. The waiter came and went. We started with a beet salad, then a bowl of creamy herb soup. Trina leaned in and asked how I'd been sleeping. Her voice was soft, almost comforting. I told her part of the truth. The nights were quiet, sometimes too quiet. Miles listened, but let her do most of the talking. He was more interested in the wine list, asking about pairings, suggesting desserts. It felt odd, watching them together. They weren't openly affectionate, but there was a rhythm to the way they shared glances, like passing notes across a classroom. By the time the lamb and carrots arrived, the mood had shifted. Trina's tone was brighter, almost eager. She asked if I'd been down to the lake lately. I said not since late summer. She nodded, pleased, then turned to Miles. She started talking about what a perfect setting it would be for small gatherings, weddings, retreats, weekend escapes. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched Miles cutting his meat into neat, steady bites. His hands were steady. Mine were not. Trina kept talking about the natural light, how the cabin could be restored, how her friend in Omaha ran a boutique hospitality company. Then she turned to me and smiled. She said the land was a gift and gifts should be shared. I set my fork down. Something inside me went very still. When dessert arrived, Miles reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. The papers inside were clipped together, highlighted neatly. He spoke plainly, said they'd spoken with a few professionals, just to get a sense of things. If I signed that night, we could begin the process early. No pressure, he said. Trina added softly that I could still live there. Nothing would change without asking me. It was just legal housekeeping, she called it. The light above our table was warm and golden, but I felt cold clear through. I looked down at the document. My name was already printed across the top, and in that moment, I realized I hadn't been invited to dinner. I'd been summoned. I leaned back, letting the sweet smell of dessert drift past me. The table was quiet except for the sound of Trina's spoon tapping her creme brulee. Miles slid the folder closer across the tablecloth. His voice was even, calm, like he was offering me a warm blanket instead of a legal contract. He called it a simple deed transfer, just to tidy things up before winter, he said. Every word was chosen carefully, meant to sound harmless. He didn't look me in the eye, but Trina did. Her gaze stayed fixed on me, steady as stone. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't touch the papers. He went on about taxes, about managing things better if the land were in his name. He said my name would still appear, just not as the primary owner. Trina nodded along, adding little reassurances. It was rehearsed. I asked what the rush was. Miles chuckled, said there wasn't one, but the way he leaned forward, elbows on the table, told me otherwise. Trina spoke up again, her tone gentle but edged. She said she'd already talked to a local consultant, just in case, according to her, the town might be looking at rezoning lakeside property. It would be wise to act before anything changed. That word act hung heavy in the air. I opened the folder slowly. The first page had my full name in bold letters. The next showed the parcel number, coordinates, and a clause transferring full ownership. One line was highlighted near the bottom. It said I could remain on the property, but all development rights would belong to Miles. A single signature line waited for me. Mine. I closed the folder without reading more. My breathing was steady, but my chest felt tight. I told them I wasn't feeling well. Trina's expression didn't waver. She touched my wrist lightly, said we could always do this another time. Miles smiled, though I noticed how his jaw tensed. His hand stayed resting on the folder when I stood. The waiter came back with the bill, and Miles brushed it off with a practiced wave. He stood and helped me with my coat, polite to the very last detail. When we stepped outside, the November wine cut sharp against my face. The parking lot was nearly empty. I could hear the scrape of my boots on the pavement. No one spoke during the drive home. The headlights sliced through the fog in long beams of silence. When we reached my porch, Miles asked again too casually if I'd think it over. I nodded. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. Trina stayed in the car. Inside, I set the folder on the kitchen table and just stared at it. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked into the living room and sat near the window. Through the trees, I could just make out the faint shimmer of the lake in the dark. That land had been in my family for 3 generations. My late husband used to say it held more memory than soil. I had always believed him. Now I wondered if my son had ever believed it at all. The next morning, I woke with a tight ache across my chest. It wasn't from the food. It was from everything else. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, staring at the thin light slipping through the curtains. The room felt colder than usual, even with the heater humming. My slippers, worn thin at the edges, felt like the only steady ground beneath me. I moved slowly, as if my body already understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. At breakfast, the coffee tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I stirred in. I wasn't hungry, though I made toast out of habit. I chewed through it like paper. My thoughts kept circling back to last night, the way Miles avoided my eyes after pushing those papers across the table, the practiced tone in Trina's voice, the way her hand rested so easily on that pen, like she'd been waiting for this moment all along. That dinner hadn't been about family. It had been a business transaction, and I was the asset. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe they were just planning ahead. But the knot in my stomach said otherwise. It wasn't just the request. It was the way they looked at me as though it was already theirs. By noon, I stepped out onto the porch. The lake was calm, glassy, and touched. A line of geese floated across the water like black stitches on satin. For years, this house had been my quiet refuge, but now the silence pressed in heavy. The trees no longer felt like protection. They felt like witnesses. I walked slowly down the back path toward the bench by the lake. My husband built that bench the year before he passed. He used to sit there with his thermos, humming old folk songs. That spot had always been sacred. I sat down and let the weight in my chest settle. In my mind, I could still hear his voice. He had been clear about the land. It was to stay in the family, not for profit, not for projects, but for roots. He trusted me to carry that forward. I had always imagined one day passing it on to Miles, when he was ready, when he understood, but last night made it clear. He didn't care about the soul of the land. He only cared about its value. When I came back inside, I walked past the hallway where the family photos hung. I stopped. One was missing. It had been a small frame, a picture of me years ago holding a basket of flowers by the lake. Miles had taken it one spring morning. He once told me it was the most peaceful I had ever looked. I checked the drawer where we kept spare frames, but it wasn't there either. I stared at the empty space on the wall. I didn't need to be told twice. That picture was gone, just like the part of me they no longer found worth keeping. That night, I didn't bother cooking. I opened a can of soup and let it sit too long on the stove. I wasn't angry, not yet, just hollow. I sat by the window with the curtains pulled tight. The lake outside reflected only a sliver of moonlight. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat very still, listening, as if his voice might come through the night breeze. But all I heard was silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not grief, not fear, but the first stirrings of resolve. 2 days later, I found myself on Miles's porch with a box in my hands. It wasn't planned. The box held old kitchen tins he'd loved as a boy, and I thought I'd drop them off before the holidays. Just a small gesture. I stood there for a moment, staring at the neat little wreath on their door. Red ribbon, no soul, like something ordered in bulk. Trina opened the door. Her smile was tight. She stepped aside quickly, barely leaving space for me to pass. The warmth inside felt staged, like a house dressed for company but empty underneath. I stepped into the hall and froze. On the wall was a brand new collage of family photos, glossy prints arranged perfectly, a trip to the lake, a birthday party, a backyard barbecue. But I wasn't in any of them, not one. I stepped closer, my fingers hovering just above the glass. Miles was in the center of most of the pictures, his arm around Trina or one of the kids. They all looked polished, complete. But my place was gone, as if I'd never been there at all. Trina passed behind me, mentioning casually that they'd just printed them last week as a surprise holiday gift. Her voice was soft, but there was no apology in it, no recognition either. I turned away and set the tin box down on the entry table. Miles wasn't home. At least that's what she told me. I didn't ask where he was. I didn't want to hear another excuse that would twist inside me for days. On my way out, I noticed a pile of wrapped gifts near the fireplace. One small box had a tag that said Grandma in a child's handwriting. A card sat on top, scribbled in crayon. It said, "Miss you." I almost cried right there, but instead I straightened my back and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, sharp and fast, cutting straight through my coat. I walked to my car with my hands shoved deep in my pockets. As I pulled out of the driveway, I passed a sign for a Thanksgiving service at the church. It hit me then I hadn't been invited this year. No one had called. No one had asked what I was doing. Most years I'd bring the stuffing or the pumpkin pie. This year, nothing. Not even a mention. Back home, I sat on the porch for a long time, that wall of photos still burning in my mind. The polished smiles, the clean lines, the absence of me. It wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. It was erasure. Inside, I reached for the old photo album on the bookshelf. The real one. The one with soft light, crooked smiles, and smudged edges. Pages filled with Miles as a boy, jelly on his cheeks. With my husband cleaning fish by the lake. With Trina before her smile learned to hide her eyes. I turned the pages until I found the picture they'd removed, the one of Miles and me on the dock when he was 8, holding a frog with both hands, his eyes wide with joy. I slid it out of the sleeve and placed it in a small frame. Then I set it on the windowsill, where the afternoon sun landed just right. Where no one could take it down. It was time to remember what was real, even if they didn't. It began one morning with a voice drifting through the open kitchen window. I had just come in from sweeping the porch when I heard it low, urgent, carried by the wind. I froze, broom still in my hand. It was Trina. She was outside on her phone, pacing along the gravel path near the hedgerow. She must have thought I wasn't home. Or maybe she didn't care. Her words were sharp, clipped. She spoke about permits, investors, and something called the Breener Retreat at Lone Lake. She said it like the plans were already carved in stone. My heart thudded as I inched closer to the window. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't stop myself. Trina mentioned the last parcel. Esther's land, she said. Once that was signed over, they could move forward. It was the final piece. I stood rooted in place. So that was it. This wasn't about family at all. It never had been. That dinner, the smiles, even the children's card, it was all a performance. A setup to soften me, to coax me into giving up the only thing I had left. Not just a house, not just a lakefront view, but the very ground my life had been built on, and they had turned it into marketing. Trina's voice carried on, smooth and certain. She talked about branding, about how perfect the story was, how I had once run women's circles, hosted summer workshops. They'd use that for grants, for legacy projects. They'd spin my name, my work, my history into a selling point. I stepped back from the window, my hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from a cold, sharp clarity. Trina was clever, calculated, but she had underestimated me. She thought I was just old, sentimental, easy to sway. She had forgotten I kept every document, every newsletter, every photo from every gathering. I still had the ledgers, the grant reports, the letters from girls who once came here to learn, to belong. This land wasn't just property. It was memory, care, identity. And she wanted to pave over it for retreats and weddings. That night, I pulled out the old file box from the linen closet. Inside were copies of every deed, every grant, every original agreement. My husband had signed the deed with a note. This land is for Esther. Let it stay hers. Let it serve. He never trusted smooth talk. And now, neither would I. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I made a list, names of people I could call. The lawyer who had once helped my husband draft our will. Neighbors who had served on the community board. Women from the old circle, quiet allies, but steady ones. By morning, I had a plan, not to fight with anger, but to reclaim what was mine with precision. Trina had her project. Now I had mine. That morning, I brewed a pot of coffee and set it beside the thick file of documents I'd pulled from storage. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Like time itself, my hands didn't shake this time. By mid-morning, I dialed the number. Harold Tilson. He was retired now, living in a quieter town up north, but his voice still carried that calm steadiness I remembered. I introduced myself, though I didn't need to. He remembered. When I explained why I was calling, there was a pause. Not surprise, just the kind of silence that comes with knowing. We spoke for nearly an hour. I told him about the dinner, about Trina, about what I had overheard. He asked careful questions, clear and steady, then laid out options. He reminded me the original deed was strong. My name held full custodial rights. But if I wanted to make sure the land could never be touched, there were stronger protections. He told me about a community trust, a way to secure the property under a defined purpose, a structure that aligned with my husband's wishes. If I placed the land into a trust with a board, it would remain untouchable, serving not profit, but a cause. Then he said something that rang in my chest like a quiet bell. Esther, your name means something in that town. Don't forget that. After we hung up, I sat with those words for a long while. My name, my place, I wasn't fading. I had only stepped back. Now it was time to step forward. I called the community center and left a message for Diane, the director. Then I rang Loretta, who used to run the reading program, and Mara, who still taught workshops at the Lake Library. These were women who had organized fundraisers, written grants, baked pies when no one else would. Quiet power, real power. By afternoon, we had agreed to meet, not for tea, for strategy. That evening, I drafted a mission statement. I called it the Light on the Lake Foundation, a program dedicated to older women's skills training, seasonal retreats, circles for storytelling. The land would be its anchor. I would fund the first step with my savings. No signatures, no permissions given away. I wasn't going to hand over my land. I was going to give it new life on my terms. That Sunday, the church pews were packed with wool coats and the faint scent of old hymnals. The November wind had rattled through town all week, but inside the chapel it was warm, filled with familiar voices and steady organ chords. I sat in my usual spot, third row from the back, where I'd sat nearly every other Sunday of my life. But that morning, it felt different. Or maybe I was different. Reverend Hatch stepped to the pulpit. His voice was worn, softened by years of baptizing children and burying neighbors. He never thundered about fire and brimstone. He spoke instead of the small things that held us together. He read from Corinthians, then closed the Bible and said something that rooted itself deep inside me. Forgiveness does not mean surrender. You can love someone and still not hand them the keys to your house, your peace, or your land. A few heads turned, some nodded. I stayed still. I knew it wasn't meant just for me. But it felt like God had planted that line in his mouth for my ears alone. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. What I felt wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. After service, I didn't stay for cookies or coffee. I walked home with my gloves in one hand and my coat pulled tight against the wind. My steps were steady, not rushed. The lake was low this time of year, the branches bare and clawing at the gray sky, but I could already imagine it full again in spring. Back home, I opened my sewing box. Not for thread or needles, but for the envelope tucked beneath the false bottom. It was the last letter my husband had written to me in his careful hand. You built this house, Esther. You grew the garden, taught the classes, opened your hands to everyone. If the day comes when someone tries to take what you've made, protect it. It belongs to your spirit. I read it twice, then set it aside. My spirit had been quiet too long. By late afternoon, Diane, Loretta, and Mara arrived. I had set the kettle to boil and cleared a table for notebooks and a blank whiteboard by the window. They came bundled in coats, cheeks red from the cold, eyes bright with a kind of purpose only women our age carry, quiet, immovable. We worked for hours, sketching out what the Light on the Lake Foundation would become. Retreats for women over 50, writing circles, cooking classes, walks by the water where conversations could unfold without hurry. The land would not be sold. It would be shared, wisely and with intention. As the sky deepened into indigo and the streetlights flickered on, I looked around that table. These weren't just old friends. They were builders, guardians of something worth keeping. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel outnumbered. I felt rooted. And as we closed the evening with peppermint tea and plans to meet again, I knew it wasn't just about saving the land. It was about saving something sacred in myself. The land was mine, but now, so was my voice. Miles Trina. It was a Thursday afternoon when their car pulled into the gravel drive. I saw it through the kitchen window, tires crunching over the frost like brittle glass. I dried my hands on a dish towel, my heartbeat steady, not racing. They came in with bright smiles, too polished, too cheerful for two people who had cornered me with papers not long ago. Trina wore a crimson coat trimmed with fur, a leather binder tucked under her arm. Miles kept his hands buried in his pockets, like a boy rehearsing an apology he didn't believe. They sat on the couch, while I stayed in my chair by the window. The sun angled through, catching the dust in the air. The house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and lentils simmering on the stove. Trina opened her binder first. Her words flowed smooth, to smooth about investors, tax breaks, the profits to be made from a boutique retreat. She spread out color-coded charts and maps across my coffee table. Her voice filled the room, but it was hollow. I noticed she never once used the word family. She never said home. Miles nodded occasionally, avoiding my eyes. Letting her lead as always. At the end, she turned a page and pointed. There were my initials typed neatly next to a line labeled Property Owner Approval. Signature required. She smiled like it was already finished. I didn't lean forward. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I reached beside my chair for a manila envelope and pulled out a single sheet. This, I said, laying it flat, is from my lawyer. It confirms the lake property now belongs to the Light on the Lake Foundation. I am no longer the sole owner, and the foundation has no intention of selling. Trina's face froze. She blinked once, like her mind was catching up to her ears. Miles leaned forward, his voice soft, uncertain. Why didn't you talk to us first? I looked at him and felt the last of the old ache settle into stillness, because I did, that night at dinner, and you made it clear what you wanted had nothing to do with me. This land was never meant for profit. It was meant to outlive us with dignity. Trina closed her binder without a word. Her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with fury barely held back. She stood first. Miles followed, slower, avoiding my eyes. They walked out without saying goodbye. I didn't watch them leave. I gathered the papers Trina had left on the table, glanced at them once, then slid them into the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges inward like dry leaves. I stood there until nothing remained but ash. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the cold through the trees. But inside, I felt warm, not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped waiting for them to understand. I had made peace with being misunderstood. For the first time, the house felt completely mine. The morning of the foundation's launch, the lake was wrapped in mist. Its surface was still, mirroring the gray sky above. I stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee in my hands, listening to the silence. For once, it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The event wasn't meant to be grand. I had asked for it to stay small, intimate. Just a few from the community, some women from the senior center, the local pastor, and the lawyer who had guided me through it all. No banners, no photographers. Just folding chairs beneath the sycamore tree, facing a simple wooden platform with the lake as a backdrop. People began arriving around 10 women I had once taught budgeting to at the community office, a retired librarian who had run the literacy program, a widow whose daughter had left town and never wrote back. We hugged, we smiled. Some eyes were already damp before I even spoke. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at their faces. The crowd was quiet, patient. I suppose you're wondering why I'm standing here instead of sitting quietly at home, I said. A few chuckles rose, soft but kind. The truth is, I spent too long waiting for those closest to me to understand what mattered. And slowly, painfully, I learned sometimes you have to stop waiting. Sometimes you just start building, even if it's only for yourself. I paused, turning my eyes toward the water. This land was never meant to be a business deal. It was meant to be a place where something good could take root. So today, we begin the Light on the Lake Foundation. Our first mission will be to support women in their later years with training, with housing help, with whatever restores a sense of control in a world that too often forgets us. Heads nodded, some eyes shining. A woman whispered to her neighbor and dabbed her cheek with a tissue. I'm not handing this land over to someone else's legacy. I'm keeping it where it belongs with those of us who still believe in second chances, no matter our age. Applause rose, not thunderous, but steady, the kind that sinks into your bones like a warm coat on a cold day. After the ceremony, We shared soup and cornbread. Some brought pies wrapped in foil. There was laughter. There were stories. We weren't young, but in that moment, we were strong and whole. The lake sat quietly, bearing witness. I didn't think about Miles or Trina, not once. Because that day wasn't about who wasn't there. It was about who chose to be. And I had finally chosen myself. It was a quiet Thursday when I saw the headline. The local paper set folded on the porch bench, left there by Marlene like always. I didn't expect much. Usually it was school board updates or bake sale winners. But that morning, Trina's name was splashed across the front page. The headline was sharp. Breener's lakefront project collapses amid funding loss and community pushback. I read it once, then again more slowly. Beneath it was a black and white photo of Trina at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, her posture straight, her half-smile camera ready. But on newsprint, she looked smaller somehow. The article wasn't long, but it was thorough. It explained how her proposed boutique retreat had failed to attract investors, how the community had raised concerns about land use, environmental impact, and the dishonesty around the property's history. There were quotes from neighbors. One said, "It never felt like it was meant for us." Another simply said, "I'm glad the land stayed where it belongs." I folded the paper carefully and set it back on the bench before going inside. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of victory, just stillness, and a quiet certainty that the choices I'd made mattered, even if they went unnoticed. Later that day, I walked down to the lake. The air smelled of pine and something faintly sweet. The rain from the night before left the ground soft under my shoes. I stood at the edge, watching the water lap gently at the shore. Not fierce, not hurried, just steady. Miles hadn't called. Trina hadn't come by. Maybe they never would, and for the first time, that thought didn't trouble me. I had spent years waiting for people to become who I wished they were. But maybe letting go wasn't losing them. Maybe it was finally seeing them for who they had always been. Inside, I poured myself a cup of tea and settled into the armchair by the window. The same chair where I used to read with the kids when they were small. I opened my journal and wrote one line across the top of the page. "I am not someone you erase." Then I set the pen down and smiled. Not bitter, not proud, just whole. I had kept a small mirror tucked away in a drawer for years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a thin wooden frame, worn soft at the corners, the kind of thing you'd find at a yard sale. The morning after that article ran, I placed it on the table beside my favorite chair. The air outside was clear and cold, the lake glittering like glass through the window. I sat wrapped in the old green shawl Jack had given me for our anniversary, a faint cedar scent still clinging to the fabric. I angled the mirror so it caught the morning light. There was my reflection-lined face, softer eyes, lips pressed together, not in sorrow, not in regret, but in quiet understanding. Every morning since, I've looked into that mirror. Not to check my hair or see how old I've grown, but to ask myself a simple question, never out loud, just in thought. Did I live today with truth? Did I show up for myself the way I once wished others had? The answer hasn't always been yes, but more often now, it is. The house has grown peaceful again. The silence isn't empty anymore. It breathes. It holds memory and makes room for new beginnings. The land isn't just something to guard. It's something to share. Women gather here now with their own stories of loss, of rebuilding, of finding their way back. Miles hasn't called. Trina has faded from town meetings. I hear whispers, but I don't lean in to catch them. That's not my story anymore. I've found a rhythm in the quiet. Mornings with tea and the mirror. Afternoons teaching women how to read contracts, apply for grants, protect what's theirs. Evenings listening to the lake lap against the rocks, steady as a heartbeat. If someone had told me years ago that I'd find peace not in being remembered by my children, but in being remembered by strangers, I wouldn't have believed it. But sometimes peace arrives in places you never expected. And sometimes the smallest mirror reflects the biggest truth. You are never invisible. You are simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes, beginning with your own.